I'm Nick. Welcome to the first devlog for Fourth Time Around, Pennywhistle Studios' upcoming short surreal horror title. Fourth Time Around is a retro PS1 style walking sim horror game with no jump scares. There's a heavy emphasis on atmosphere and building tension. Everything we're doing, from the writing style to the soundscaping to the gameplay decisions to the texturing, we're working very hard to ensure that everything is intentionally placed to deliver a very specific kind of experience for the player. In Fourth Time Around, you'll play as Henry, and you'll experience life through his eyes. Are interwoven as a series of short vignettes with these jarring paratopic-style jump cuts bridging them. Paratopic was actually a pretty big inspiration for this game, if not so much stylistically or in its story or its writing, but more as like a battle-tested proof of concept, right? That this kind of game can work and hopefully find an audience. This series is probably going to be a little bit different from your conventional devlogs, especially in this indie horror game space. I want to use this time as sort of a personal journal to document the things that I'm finding interesting as I'm going through the development process, because this really is my first time going start to finish on a commercial, fully fledged game. And the truth is, I just don't find the technical side of game development that interesting to talk about. So what I want to do here is focus a little bit more on the sort of philosophy, if you could call it that, behind my approach to development, which I am hoping is at least a little bit unique, and maybe focus on some of the higher level concepts that I'm finding extra noteworthy for one reason or another. But if you're curious, I'll flash the most important components of the game's tech stack and tooling here. There's nothing super out of the ordinary, but one thing that is probably important to note is that pretty much nothing pre-made is going in out of the box, so things like PS1 style shaders or the character controller, things that I found online or in the Unity asset store, they're all modified to various degrees just to help with stylistic cohesion. Otherwise, I don't think there's anything super interesting to talk about here. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. Okay, with that out of the way, I think we can get into it. So Fourth Time Around is short. And that means we have to be really careful with how we handle tension and release, which are, like, I think it's pretty well established at this point, the building blocks of, I mean, really every artistic medium that has some sort of, like, temporal component, right, that happens across time, film, games, whatever, but we're talking about horror in particular here. So let's dive into that a little bit more.
Il n'est pas d'orchestre. It is an illusion.
I love this scene from Mulholland Drive, which is actually a film I hadn't watched prior to starting work on Fourth Time Around. It's something I sought out really intentionally looking for inspiration for the game, and it pretty much immediately became one of my favorite movies ever, like more immediately than I think anything has in the past. And I'm not going to risk spoiling it in this video because I really do think it's one of those films that is best served by going in as blind as possible, but I do want to highlight this scene in particular and what I took away from it outside of the context of the film. At the end of the day, everything we do in game development, we do in service of evoking a feeling in the player. Or at least everything I do is in service of evoking a feeling. That's sort of my MO as a game developer. I'm not saying this to be prescriptive necessarily, right? There's lots of folks who have other approaches that work just as well for them. It's like how in music you can have improvisation that you approach from a modal way of thinking or from a functional harmony way of thinking, and the end result can be identical even though the underlying methodology isn't, right? It's like you have two paths that lead to the same place, except it's not just two paths, right? You have infinite paths, but this one is mine, so I want to talk about it here. When you're playing Fourth Time Around, I want you to feel unsettled. I want you to feel disoriented. I want you to feel like anything could happen, not just within the game, but beyond the screen, right? To you personally sitting in your chair at home. It's that deeper level of immersion where you go beyond just engaging with the game and its world and experiencing it vicariously through your in-game avatar. You go past all of that and you start to really like empathize with it and feel it. Fourth Time Around isn't a mechanics-rich experience. It doesn't have that kind of infinite depth in its gameplay that lends itself to endless replayability, right? It's not a game with systems you can learn and improve at over time. There aren't even any real puzzles to speak of. If walking sim is an outright derisive label for a game to you, then you probably wouldn't have a lot of positive things to say about it. And that's okay. It's not trying to be any of those things, right? If someone were to play fourth time around and walk away saying, yeah, I mean, I didn't really get to do much in the game, I wouldn't really consider that a failure so much as a misalignment of that player's expectations for what a game should offer and what we're trying to deliver with fourth time around. On the other hand, if someone were to say, yeah, I mean, I didn't really feel much when I was playing it, that's a criticism I would take much more seriously. Like, if I hear that, I failed at accomplishing my goal, at least for that player. Hopefully at this point, my whole sort of approach to development is becoming clearer, right? Everything we're doing, from the visual style in the game, the soundscaping, the pacing, the writing, the gameplay mechanics, as far as those actually exist, is with the intention of evoking a very particular feeling in the player, a feeling of like uncertainty or unease or whatever it is. When something happens in the game, or when you do something, I want you to feel a certain way about it. And I also care a lot about the order those feelings come in and how long they last. Almost as bad as I didn't feel anything is I felt too much too fast, or I felt this feeling for way too long. These like tonal dissonances or immersion shattering emotional whiplash, those are all things I'm super cognizant of, and I'm really trying to avoid them with my development here. So how does all of that tie into the scene from Mulholland Drive? Well, if you take it literally as the film peeling back the curtain in this sort of fourth wall breaking way, we can extract something really useful. It's all an illusion. Everything we're doing here in the game is fake. You feel unsettled or disoriented or afraid or whatever, but nothing's actually going to happen to you, right? You're not actually disoriented. You're at home, you're in your chair, in your room, or wherever you are, right? You feel like the game is going to reach across the screen and grab you, but it can't. And that might seem super obvious or trite to say, but the feeling we're selling the player is that all of that stuff, it's really there. It's really happening to them. And as a developer, that needs to be at the very top of my mind, probably above anything else in the world, because the second you as a player remember that, the whole thing falls apart. The feeling's gone. The illusion is shattered. Suddenly this game, this experience I'm trying to curate, it doesn't have anything to offer you. It was all an illusion. And I need to do everything I can to keep that thought as far away from you as possible. So when we're talking about building tension in a horror game, I think of it sort of like accruing capital. You can contribute nominally, right, with your sound design or with your environment or whatever it is that you're doing to add to this big pile of tension. And it also accrues interest over time, right? It compounds. Everything the player experiences at some moment, a particular moment in your game, they're experiencing within the context of everything that happened prior to it, and it's going to inform everything that happens after it. But when you deliver a jump scare, you're cashing in on all that capital that you built, all that tension, everything the player's been experiencing. You're spending that on a single high-octane injection of feeling, right? You're trading all of that tension, that unease, that uncertainty for one single burst of, fear? Maybe? Startling? Probably that, more than anything, right? I mean, but something else happens. Think about what you do in response to a jump scare. After that initial burst dies down, you take a moment to reorient yourself, to find your bearings, and you're at home, right? You're not actually in any danger from the game. It was all an illusion. So why horror with no jump scares? Because every jump scare brings that thought, the thing I'm working so hard to keep from you, right to the forefront of your mind. It pulls back the curtain. And in a short game like this, there's just no time to rebuild everything I worked towards building in the first place. Maybe in a longer game, like a Silent Hill or Resident Evil or whatever it is, that could be a useful thing. You don't want to keep the player in that hyper-tense mode forever, right? It's just not a sustainable feeling. You have to give them some sort of reprieve, so the scare might be super useful for that. But in a short game like this, there's just no time to go back and forth. David Szymanski is a developer who understands this stuff so intrinsically, I'm not sure if he's ever had to think about it consciously or not. I'd actually be super curious to find out. When you look at a game like Iron Lung, it's brilliant because it cashes in on all of its tension right at the very end of the game. The jump scare happens and the credits roll. He does the same thing with Scroll Stapler. By the time he breaks the illusion, the game's already over. It never has to deal with the fallout, and I just think that's brilliant. So at this point, I've spent a lot of time talking about why I'm trying to build tension for the player and why I'm not trying to break it, but I've talked very little about how I'm actually doing that, and there's a good reason. It's because the answer really isn't that complicated. You probably already have a pretty good idea of everything I would have to say here. Like, just take a look at this scene and think about what you notice. Visually, we have this really striking image of this cabin obfuscated by fog and this really imposing lighting situation going on. Hopefully you feel a little bit claustrophobic with the cornfields closing in on either side of you. Soundscaping-wise, there's very little happening aside from some ambient wind noises, so when you do hear that rustling in the leaves next to you and you turn to see nothing there, it's unsettling. At least I hope it is. You're approaching this menacing figure in front of you and you have no idea what it's gonna do. This stuff's all pretty textbook though, right? I mean, like, at the end of the day, it's just spooky visuals and weird noises. To me, the most critical thing about this scene is that it never actually lets off the gas by delivering on some big scare. So yeah, that's what I have to say about tension and jump scares. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to get through with this devlog. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. For smaller things, I'll do my best just to get back to you down there in the comment section, but for larger things, maybe I would be happy to turn them into a whole video or at least a segment in a future devlog. Hey, and if the footage that you're seeing from fourth time around looks interesting to you, or maybe if just the sort of philosophical ideas behind its development have been interesting to you, I would appreciate it and love it so much if you could go to Steam. There's a link in the description, or you can just search fourth time around in the Steam search box and give it a wish list. Follow us here on YouTube. We've also been doing some content on TikTok and giving some regular updates on Twitter, so if you're interested, go check that out. We'll get back to work on the game. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.